such a nice introduction, Mia. And Save the Redwoods League is so committed to making sure that we have the parks that you all help maintain and make available to the public. And so much of what we do in the future, how we manage our lands, where we buy and create the next parks, has to come from a place of understanding how the forest works and how it's going to be affected by coming changes. And climate change is this big thing that we hear about all the time, and it's really hard to understand. How do we take what we know about climate change and apply it to managing forests? And I wish I could tell you everything you need to know to make those decisions, and I'm not going to be able to today. But I'm going to tell you about what we do know and how we're going to get to hopefully knowing more about impacts of climate change on the redwood forest in the future. The League has launched this Redwoods and Climate Change Initiative, which is an integrative program to understand the basic question, what is going to happen to the redwood forests in the future? And today I'm going to talk to you about what we know and what we're going to find out. And I'm going to show you a lot of beautiful pictures so we can pretend that we're in the woods today, which is always really fun. And I just wanted to start with this. And the goal of the Save the Redwoods League really is to protect redwood forests in perpetuity. That's been our mission since 1918. And today, what does that mean? And we're having to think about that in a completely different way. What does it mean once we've created a park and we have these magnificent trees that are available to the public? How do we protect them now going forward when the threat is no longer just the axe? It has to do with many more complicated issues, and climate change is something that's pervasive. Climate change is something that's going to affect old forests, young forests, and everything in between. And it's not going to matter who owns the property or who's managing it. It's a common problem that parks and private lands all have to face. The amazing thing about redwood forests is they have a deep history in dealing with climate change. Different from today, but they've been experiencing climate change for millions of years. And they experience climate change day to day. There's an incredible amount of variability that a single tree will experience when it comes to climate. They will experience different climate at the base of the tree than they will up at the top of the tree on a daily basis. They will be experiencing swings in climate over the course of the year. That all is part of what we say when we talk about climate. We have to acknowledge that. Climate is also very different from the northern part of the Coast Redwood Range down to the south. So redwoods deal with climate on many, many scales, and it makes it a very complicated issue. Well, we have to think about the fact that redwoods have been on our planet for millions and millions of years. Back in the Jurassic, when conifers were dominant, we had what we think were the first sequoia. And here's an example fossil of the foliage. They've been around for a really, really long time. So we're talking 200 million years ago. Over time, if we fast forward a bit and go to 66 million years ago, we had sequoia all the way west into Wyoming. We have good fossil records that they were fairly extensive across North America. But over the more recent millions of years, there's been a contraction. And we've seen the redwood forest range get pulled to and remaining only on the west coast. 5.3 million years ago, we had what we would consider more modern redwood forest flora. We had the trees, we had the understory plants, with some additional species that are no longer present. We had redwood forest down to Santa Barbara area, and as climate has dried out on the west coast, there's been a contraction to where the redwood forest is today. Here, if we think about present, on the satellite image, we've marked in green where we find the extent of the Coast Redwood Range today. Part of this is a result of that changing in climate, this relic ecosystem here. And it's also slightly smaller, as you know, because of the land use history, where the redwood forest was converted to urban and other residential uses, where redwoods were logged for timber. There's been an increasing amount of fragmentation, and very little of the old growth redwood forest remains. For me, this poses the question, if we think about not the land use part of the redwood forest range contracting, but just what's happened with climate over the last millions of years. So is this half glass full or half glass empty? And what I mean by that is redwoods and redwood forests have been around for millions of years. They're still here, and climate has changed dramatically. So is it that they have this inherent ability to tolerate major climatic changes, and therefore they will be resilient in the future? Or is it that climate is slowly getting rid of redwood forests and it's just taking millions of years to do it? Here's another map that shows you where the Coast Redwood Forest range is. The green represents the original extent of the Coast Redwood Range before we had a settlement by Europeans and land use conversion. If you can see, it's probably pretty difficult. The small red patches are where we actually have old growth. Climate change now is different from previous millions of years of climate change because it's happening at an accelerated rate, and it's happening to an ecosystem that doesn't have as much space on the landscape to change. And so the fragmentation is creating a novel condition that the redwood forest hasn't experienced before. Here are some pictures of the redwood forest. If we want to help the redwood forest get through the coming decades and maybe centuries of very quick climate change, how do we promote resiliency in our actions? We want to have a complex forest with really tall trees that can support all of the critters that live up in the canopy, like this one. Absolutely adorable. This is the lungless wandering salamander. It only lives up in the tops of really old redwood trees up in Humboldt and Del Norte County. We want to have wild flowing rivers. And we want to have these trees because they're part of our solution to climate change. They are locking up a ton of carbon dioxide, literally tons of carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. And if we lose our forests, we're just going to be accelerating our climate change problems, and we don't want that. And my question at the bottom here is, how do we support this ecosystem resiliency? How do we keep all of these things intact in the redwood forest? Well, we have to understand how climate is impacting them, all of those things. So today I'm going to talk to you about three central questions. First of all, what is redwood ecosystem climate? Really simple question, but let's start with that. Then I'll talk to you about how redwood forest plants are responding to climate right now. Let's not try to predict what's going to happen in the future until we understand how these forests work now. And then I'll talk to you about how we're studying and trying to predict what will happen in the future with climate change. So the first question, really, what is redwood forest climate? Here's a graph that talks about the basic pattern that you're probably all familiar with. Temperature in our Mediterranean climate here on the west coast is highest during the summer months. That's at the same time when rainfall is taking a dive. We get very little to no rainfall in California during the summer. This big circle in between these two layers of data, this is what we call climatic drought. This means there's high demand for water because of the high temperatures, but there isn't a lot of water coming into the ecosystem to support that demand. Luckily, as we all know, and I'm sure for those of you that are working out in the headlands or here, you experience a lot of fog. So at the time when we have very little rainfall during the summer, that's when we have the most fog days. You can have fog any time of the year, but that peak is really happening during the summer. So those variables typically define our Mediterranean climate here on the west coast. But those averages, those graphs I just showed you, that's for a single place in time. For the whole redwood forest region, we have to realize that it's very different up in the very northern Coast Redwood Forest than it is out in the south. There's double the amount of rainfall. The other thing is that fog is even more spatially variable and dynamic. It comes and goes, it's very transient. And so I'm going to take you through a progression. This is a satellite image where you can see where fog has come onto the landscape here around the Bay Area. And just in the matter of a few hours, we can see that fog can retreat really quickly. It's actually very difficult for us to predict where fog is going to be at any given day. I tried to chase fog when I was in graduate school, and it was really, really, really hard. So what do we know about climate in the redwood forest? We know that climate is very different at the tops of the trees than it is from the bottom, but we haven't even measured that systematically throughout the redwood forest yet. And that's going to influence which tree species do well and what types of animals are going to be able to live there. And those different vertical layers of the redwood forest may change differently with coming climate change. We know that generally we have a Mediterranean climate, but where you are in California dictates what your ultimate temperatures are at the peak of the summer, how much rainfall you're getting, and then fog is just really complicated. It's very dynamic and can be difficult to predict. So thinking about how do plants actually respond to these things that I'm talking about? How do they respond to rainfall? How do they respond to fog? How important are those things? These are all questions that we can get at, and many of us use physiology as a tool to understand the impact of climate on our plants. I'm going to talk to you about a series of studies that were conducted in Sonoma County, just to the east of Bodega Bay at a grove called the Grove of Old Trees. And I'm going to start with a study that asked a really simple question. Is there a summertime drought? And how do the plants respond to that? I showed you that climate graph and described that when temperatures are high and you don't have a lot of rainfall, we think of that as drought. But are the plants drought stressed? Because we know they get fog. We looked at these three species. Sword fern, this is the common understory plant that grows in the redwood forest throughout the redwood range. Sequoia sempervirens, you probably know that tree. And this one on the right, this is California Bay, Umbellularia californica. It's a common mid-canopy, lower canopy tree species. So we asked the question, are they drought stressed over the course of the year? And when does that happen? We do this with this magic machine called a pressure chamber. Really all it is we cut off a leaf or a small segment of shoot, some stem, and when we're doing that, we're severing the water column that's inside the wood of the plant or inside the petiole of the leaf. When that happens, it snaps back like a rubber band because water is always under tension as it's moving up through the plant from the soil and is being evaporated and lost to the atmosphere through the leaves. So when we cut that, the water column snaps back, we put it in this chamber and we apply pressure. And we can measure how much pressure it takes to force that water column back up to the cut surface. That's an integrated measure of how hydrated the plants are for us. So we can go and take these simple measurements and understand, are the plants well hydrated? And we can track that over time. At the same time, we measured how much water was available to these plants. We did it in several ways. Two of the ways was measuring how much water was coming down into the understory of this forest through funnel fog collectors. This also measures rain, so you have to know whether it's rain or fog that's coming in. It's passively dripping down to the forest floor after the water droplets condense in the canopy above. The other way is to use a leaf wetness sensor, which measures when are the plants actually wet. Because what we found is that fog doesn't always create a lot of water by volume, and there isn't that much drip, but the leaves are wet. So what does that mean for the plants? And we looked at both of those attributes of water throughout this season as we were monitoring. So this is a complicated figure, and I'm going to walk you through it. The top panel here describes what was happening to the plant hydration level when we did the clippings in the morning and measured how hydrated the plants were for all three of the species. We started in the spring and we would go into the fall, and the fog season is marked with this gray box. And on the left, your axis is plant water potential. That's a measure of how much tension the water column was inside the plant. And what we see is that these open circles here, this is redwood. Redwood was generally the most hydrated. So the closer you are up to zero with water potential, that means you're a well-hydrated plant. You're happy, you're not going to wilt, you're doing really well. So generally, redwood was the most hydrated. The exceptions to this were the data points, the days when we went out and did these measurements, and we have stars indicated. That's when we went out during a fog event. If we went out and it was foggy, it was sword fern, these closed circles here, that became the most hydrated. And in this first year, sword fern went from consistently being the least hydrated plant to the most hydrated plant when it was foggy. The following year, we saw a very consistent pattern that redwoods were the most hydrated. Here's bay in the middle, intermediate, and sword fern jumped around a bit, but generally was the least hydrated. So we didn't catch any fog events during this year, and the plants were getting steadily more dehydrated as the summer went on. Then in this year, this was 2009, we saw a completely opposite pattern. As soon as in the spring, it was very warm and very dry, got very little rain that year. As soon as it became foggy, we saw all the plants became very hydrated. And it was actually then again in the fall when they started showing more signs of drought stress. So that was really interesting. What was causing this pattern? Did it have to do with rainfall or did it have to do with fog? If we look at this row here, this is through fall. This is what falls into those funnel collectors that we had distributed throughout the forest. And we see that during the fog season, by volume, there's very little water coming in. We knew we were getting a lot of fog, but there isn't a lot of water. It's just a few millimeters in our fog collectors versus what you would get during the winter. And here this shows how little rain came in between 2008 and 2009. Interestingly, in this year, where the plants were getting more and more drought stress during the course of the summer, we actually had more fog drip. we got more fog in our collectors. So that was really strange. They're not doing very well this year, but yet there seemed to be more fog. But this was in contrast to what we were measuring with those leaf wetness sensors. It turns out that in this year, we had very few hours of leaf wetness. So there was more fog coming in by volume, so they were probably intense fog events, but fewer fog events. And that did not help keep the plants very hydrated. In contrast to 2009, when there were many more cumulative hours when it was foggy. It was just wet all the time. And it didn't create a lot of volume of water available to the plants, but it had a big hydrating effect. We've also seen with the same forest, we can put sap flow sensors into the tree. So we insert these probes into the wood of the tree and measure the rate and the direction of water flow. Well, you're probably thinking direction. Why would you measure that? Water goes up from the soil and leaves the trees at the top. But actually what we found is when it was a foggy event, and here this shows us the relative humidity was 100%, we see a reversal in flow. We see that the water actually moves downward in the redwood tree. And that only can be explained by water coming in through the leaves at the top of the tree. So this leaf wetness, how many hours that the plants are wet makes a huge difference for keeping them hydrated throughout that drought season. And in fact, if there's enough hours of leaf wetness, from our data it shows they don't seem to be experiencing drought. And if it's a good foggy year where they're wet a lot, the drought seasons may actually be in the spring and the fall and not during the summer. So how does that actually happen? Why is that happening? Well, plants have mechanisms to deal with less water in the environment. They close stomata, which are the pores in the leaf surface. They close those down, and it prevents them from evaporating and losing water. Just like when we're sweating, they lose less water if they close their stomata. But that's not an airtight system, and we still lose water from the plants through transpiration. So when leaves are wet, you can't have any leakage out of the cuticle or other parts of the leaf, and even if the stomata aren't shut all the way, there isn't as much evaporative demand. So high humidity and a water layer of the leaf surface literally is like putting a cap on a glass of water, and it helps keep that water inside. The other thing that fog is doing is it's creating a water resource that these plants can absorb directly in through their leaves, through the shoots, and through the stems. We looked at this across a range of redwood forest species, and we saw that this foliar absorption, or the ability for water to go directly into the tops of plants, is really common in the redwood forest. 80% of the species we looked at are able to do it. The only exceptions that we saw that were not able to do foliar uptake was the California bay tree, when I described as the mid-canopy level tree, and redwood sorrel that grows on the forest floor. We didn't see any systematic patterns with how related the species were. We saw ferns and tree species and shrubs were able to do it. So we don't understand exactly why some species are able to do it and others aren't, and why they could do it at different rates. We're still investigating that. But foliar uptake is common. The amazing thing about foliar uptake, I'll just add, is that it doesn't take very much water by volume to hydrate a plant. You don't have to have excess water that drips down through the litter layer in the soil and comes in through the roots and goes all the way back up to the leaves, where ultimately water is needed for the plant to do photosynthesis. It just goes right there. So it doesn't take very much water then to have a really big hydrating effect in the plants. Up here in Humboldt County and Del Norte, there have been studies to look at how much fog water the plants are actually using. We know that it has a big physiological effect, and it's probably important, but what does that mean? How much water could they actually depend on over the course of the year? And this is another complicated figure, but what this shows is where the water is coming from that the plants are actually using. By extracting the water out of plants, you can look at the hydrogen stable isotope ratio, and water from fog and water from rain have very different isotopic compositions. If we extract the water out of the plants, we can see whether more of the water is coming from fog or more is coming from rain. Luckily for us, fog is very different in its isotope composition from rain, which is listed down here. And what we see is that plants generally, throughout the course of the years, they fluctuate. They're somewhere between fog and rain, meaning they're using a mix of both species. But in this third year when this study was done in 1994, it was a very big fog year, and the plants, the isotope composition was closer to fog water, meaning there was more fog getting into the plants. That means it was becoming a bigger part of their water budget. And in this year, Polystichum unitum, our western sword fern, was using up to 100% fog water during that year. And for redwoods, across all 3 years, if we average it, it was about 30% of their annual water budget was coming from fog. So it's having a big physiological effect, and it's making up a big part of their water budget, which to me is still kind of amazing because there's so little water that actually comes in through fog. The climate record, how much fog, how much rain these plants are using, is actually embedded in the cellulose that makes up the wood. And this is amazing because all these studies I've been talking to you about are really a snapshot in time, several year studies. But what is a few years worth of data for a 1,200-year-old tree? It's not very much. So we know that recently, yes, they're using a lot of fog water and they have access to it. But we want to know, have they always been this dependent on fog? If fog has changed in its frequency, can we pick that up in the tree rings? And how have the trees been growing differently as we've seen fluctuations in how much fog is available in California? So we are working with a group of scientists that are taking tree cores from redwoods throughout the redwood range and are trying to reconstruct climate to understand how redwoods have been growing differently as climate's changed over the last hundreds of years. And here's just a snapshot of a few years of the data. And I brought in the tree core and I'll just pass it around. And you can see how tiny the tree rings are. What our scientists are able to do is take little pieces of the wood and analyze the cellulose for both carbon isotopes and oxygen isotopes. And that helps us reconstruct the climate. And I won't go into the details, but I'm happy to talk to you about it later if you want to talk chemistry and physics. The methods are so good at this point that we can actually take small pieces of the tree ring and are able to reconstruct climate on a monthly basis. And so that's what's going on right now at UC Berkeley in Todd Dawson's lab. So here we have a small piece of what it looks like if you're looking at tree rings. Every year the tree is growing, it's creating new cells, and the tree is getting larger. As we go back in time, we see that this is just the stable isotope composition of cellulose for oxygen. And we see that there's a pretty big consistent pattern where the isotope ratio drops during the winter. That means it's actually more reflective of winter rain, which we would expect. And then during the summer, we're seeing a consistent fog signal. So this is in the early stage of this research, but what we're going to be able to do is see, do these peaks and valleys change over time? Do we see any shifting? Has fog always been historically important for these really long-lived individuals? So we're sampling from the oldest living trees out there in the redwood forest and also where we have access to slabs. And a lot of the parks have slabs that we can use for records as well. Okay, so just to summarize what I've been talking about, how do redwood forest plants respond to climate? We know that fog really matters. And in the several year study from Sonoma County, we realized that even if it didn't have a lot of rainfall, and it was a dry winter, if you have a lot of fog, the plants are hydrated. So there's a disconnect between rain and fog, and there's a balancing there. So if you don't have a lot of rain, but you have a lot of fog, the plants might do really well during the summer. That's when they're growing, and that has huge implications for plants being able to survive the summer drought. Right now, this is all just current climate. But the next question is that we're all curious about, so what's going to happen to redwoods as climate changes? Well, we don't even know exactly how climate is going to change. There are a lot of models, but it is very, very complicated. But what we do know is we can look back at recent climate changes, and we are picking up climate changes in California already. What we know is that climate change involves many different variables. It has to do with average temperatures, when we have heat waves, how intense those heat waves are, how many heat waves. It has to do with how humid the air is, how much fog, and how much rain. And so we're trying to take each one of those variables piece by piece, understand the response of the plants, and look at how it's already been affecting climate, how climate change has been affected. So this graph shows that fog frequency has been declining. We've seen over the since 1950, we have good climate records up and down the coast of California, and we can see that the frequency has gone down. We don't have climate records back before around 1950, when the airports started recording it. Before then, we have some scattered records, but nothing systematic where we could look at the entire state. But we do have pretty good temperature records. And the temperature difference between the coast of California and inland California correlates very, very well with fog frequency. So what's happened is the difference between temperature on the coast and inland has been lessening. That distance is shrinking. And what that's done is it's made fog come less frequently and be pulled less frequently onto land. Well, we just talked about how important fog is for many of these plants. So a drop in fog frequency could have implications for intensifying drought here in California. These are very simple climate projection models for how average temperature and precipitation for coast redwoods might change in the future. This is modeling work that is being done with one of our partners, Keely Hamilton at the California Academy of Sciences, and she's looked at this climate envelope, we call it, this average optimal climate that redwoods have today, if we average across the whole ecosystem, which has a lot of assumptions, but if we take that average temperature and precipitation and run the models to figure out where is that space going to be, where is that optimal climate going to be in 50 years, in 100 years? Well, we can run it many different ways, and it is going to depend on how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions go into the atmosphere. And so we have the A2 emissions scenario, which is the really less exciting scenario, and we have the B1's emissions scenario, where there's less emissions and maybe the outlook for climate change will be better. And you can see generally we see a reduction in how much of this climate space or optimal climate space is available for redwoods when we have greater accelerated climate change. So what that means is better temperatures and good rainfall for redwoods is generally shifting northward, and it's shifting westward, but we're on the coast, so redwoods aren't going to start living in the ocean probably. And there are big areas, especially around here in the Bay Area, where the climate that redwoods are experiencing now is totally gone. They're going to be experiencing novel climate, and this is specifically focusing on temperature and precipitation, and we think that's going to be quite different. Even in the more optimistic scenario, we're going to be losing today's climate in the Bay Area, most likely. What we can do is we can take advantage of the fact that climate is already really different from the northern part of the redwoods down to the south. I was talking to you in the beginning about how complicated it is. Well, we have really wet, cooler forests up here and warmer, drier forests in the south. And so Save the Redwoods League is using this as a natural experiment to test what happens when you have warmer, drier climate, and how does that affect how these redwood trees are able to grow and the species that are able to assemble with redwood trees. And so our Redwoods and Climate Change Initiative is putting in monitoring plots. Right now, all of them are going into old growth forests. We hope to extend into second growth, younger forests in our next phase of this research. But we're putting in plots from Jedediah Smith redwoods all the way down to Big Sur, and also in the giant sequoia region as well. And this spans the climate gradient on the coast that I was talking about. And we're very interested to see, do we see growth differences for the trees in the southern part of the range that have different climate from those in the northern part of the range? At each of these locations, we're doing a very detailed forest inventory. We are figuring out where all of the trees are, and we are making a map of not only which species are there, but how big they are, how much light is able to get down to the understory. This is going to be a very detailed carbon inventory to look at how much carbon is actually being stored in these old growth forests. And we know a very important part of that is being stored in coarse woody debris, those large trees that have fallen down to the forest floor and are staying there, big branches. Actually up in Jedediah Smith, our researchers have found that you go down, you can't even find the ground. It's been so many years, and we're talking thousands of years, of huge trees falling to the forest floor that they're just piled up. And what we walk on is very, very high above probably where the actual soil layers are. And so that just shows how much carbon can be stored up in these old forests. This is also very important habitat, of course, for amphibians and insects on the forest floor. We will be going back and doing annual mortality checks to see, are we seeing any dieback? Are we going to see any changes in the species composition of the understory or the canopy? And especially checking the tops of these trees for any signs of stress. Because the climate is so different up there, we think the tops of the trees will be an important indicator of when drought stress is occurring. How do we get up there? All of our researchers have to go up to the top of these trees, and so they are doing climbing. The researchers are from Humboldt State University and University of California, Berkeley. They're working collaboratively on this project. And when they get up there, this is what they see, and they see the forest, and they're inventorying when the tree, how reproductive the trees are. They're looking at how many seeds are being set, and also measuring the growth of these trees. Last winter was so wet, the tallest known redwood grew 5 centimeters. So it really responded to that pulse of rainwater. The tops of the trees not only may be an indicator for when drought stress is affecting the redwoods, but it also is where the reproduction is happening. When we see redwoods planted in San Francisco or around the Bay Area, if they're young, oftentimes you see cones all the way down to the bottom of the trees. But in the older trees, they really only make cones up at the very top. And reproduction by seed is more of a rare event for coast redwoods. Typically, they're reproducing as stump sprouts. So we're very keen to understand when do these trees actually set seed and what kind of environmental cues would trigger seed set. Part of this effort in the plots is to understand where the carbon is being distributed in the trees, where are they actually growing and putting on biomass, where are they building wood. And something that's been so interesting for us is to realize that redwood trees continue to grow, and they grow even faster as they get older. There's been this traditional thought that as redwood trees get older and they get bigger, their growth curves levels off. They're no longer productive. It was a great argument for, let's just cut them. Let's have a more productive forest, have younger trees that are vigorous. Well, the young trees are vigorous, but these big trees have a much larger surface area for growth. So they're actually putting on wood and building wood all the way up to the tops of the trees and on the appendages. So all of the limbs and branches, 40% of the wood that gets put on annually can be in those appendages. So in terms of carbon sequestration and locking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, these older trees are having a very important contribution in addition to the small ones. These trees are so long-lived that how do we understand when climate change is when are we going to cross the threshold? When is it going to be too hot or not enough rain or not enough fog to be a tipping point for these species? They're so long-lived, it may take us a very long time to see the effects of climate change on these large trees if we focus on the redwoods. But there are other species in the redwood forest that we think are important and we know are important indicators of climate change. One of those is Polystichum unitum, the western sword fern that I've been talking to you about. It grows very abundantly on the forest floor. And we've been mapping where do you find populations of this species and how are the populations affected by this climate gradient that I've been describing from the north of the Redwood Range down to the south of the Redwood Range. And what we see, this is a graph that shows how much leaf area cover in sword fern populations exists if we compare against how much rainfall is coming in. So we measured at many different forests, and generally what we see is that in forests that receive a lot more rainfall, here up to 2,000 millimeters annually, we have a lot more sword fern cover. So if you were to measure all of the leaves and lay them all out together, it would be a much bigger area of leaf cover. This is happening because there are more sword ferns in wetter forests. They're bigger, they're literally bigger ferns. They have more leaves per crown, and the fern fronds are actually longer. So here's a graphic that depicts from the most southern redwood forest here at this time we measured was Big Basin, all the way up to Jedediah Smith. And we see that these ferns are just literally bigger. They're bigger if it's wetter. This is something that's really easy for the public to do. And so we can take groups of the public out through a citizen science project that we've been doing in collaboration with Chabot Space and Science Center and have them measure these ferns. And we can track year to year, have the sword fern size, has it changed? In a dry year, are the new fronds that come out in the spring, are they smaller? And we can compare different forests across this latitudinal gradient. So this is this beautiful pattern that we created with the public's help. And then Muir Woods came along. Mia left, so I can't give her a bad time about this. We took out a group of students from the Berkeley School, we did the measurements, and we compared it to this existing data set that we've been collecting. And this is what we found. We found that Muir Woods is actually an outlier. It breaks up this beautiful pattern. And I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but my guess is being right against Mount Tam, there's a lot of water coming in. And I bet if we plotted this against how much rainfall was coming into these forests, it would fit into the graph I was showing you. So this has been really interesting. If the public goes out and measures how big these ferns are, it's instantly telling us something about climate. It's telling us something about how much water is available, whether it's from rainfall or fog, that's supporting these populations and allowing them to be the size they are in the forest. We also have another citizen science project I'd like to tell you about. This is something we launched on Arbor Day this year. Another way to engage the public to learn about how climate is affecting redwood forests. Climate change is such a complicated issue that it's difficult for the public to get their heads around. It's scary, we don't know what it means, and people don't want to think about it quite a bit. But we find that if we talk to them about what climate is in the redwood forest, they start to have an appreciation. Oh yeah, sometimes when I'm at Muir Woods and it's foggy, I'm getting dripped on, and they're thinking about fog. And we can make that connection to where redwoods are actually going by having them collect simple data for us that says where redwoods are actually growing within the natural range and around the world. So there are two parts to the project. This Redwood Watch project, we have an iPhone application. You can also use a regular camera to collect the pictures. It's taking a simple observation of where a redwood tree is, and it's GPS located, and we have the date and the time. We know generally where we find redwoods. We have really good GIS layers that tell us this is the redwood forest range, but we don't have a lot of the detail inside this range. We don't actually know, are those north-facing slopes, how close they are to riparian zones, and then for the edge, how are we going to know if it's changing with climate change if we're not monitoring it? We can get a lot of these data through remote sensing efforts, such as LiDAR, satellite, and that's fantastic, but it doesn't tell us very much about what's happening under the upper canopy. And so this citizen science project is a way to crowdsource. We have a lot of redwoods enthusiasts that are going to the redwoods anyway, and they're going on hikes, and they can start helping us turn this solid map into point locations where there are redwood trees, and we can go back and check them through time. So we can monitor the natural edge boundaries of the redwood forest. And we're also engaging people around the world. Redwoods have been collected and planted throughout the planet, all over the planet. They're growing in New Zealand, they're growing in Europe, and those are natural experiments that we can learn something from. We really want to know, what's that tipping point for redwood? When is it going to be too hot or too cold or too dry, and redwoods just literally can't make it anymore? And so by us knowing where redwoods have been planted in unique climates around the world, we can start to get some basic guidelines of, wow, they can't grow above this altitude as we analyze these data. And so we're creating a species niche model with the Carnegie Institute of Science and California Academy of Science to predict really where redwoods can grow today. And as we have better climate prediction models, then we're going to know if the redwood forests in the natural range are going to be affected by the predicted climate change. So that's the goal of the project. It's really simple. You just have an iPhone application. If you can use our iPhone application, you just take a picture. It uses the technology that's already built into the phone to make the GPS location. You can take notes about what you see on the tree, if you see that it does have seeds or if it has lots of stem sprouts, something about the age of the tree. Any observations can be recorded, and they get submitted to our database. Our database is being maintained by iNaturalist.org. It's a great program if you've never heard of it. They have all kinds of naturalist citizen science activities where you can take simple observations and connect them to larger science projects that are going on. And you can look on the map and see where these observations are popping up. So we're having fun engaging the public in that. And I have a bunch of postcards that give the simple instructions about how to do that if you want more information. So for example, here's a blob where a GIS says, oh, there are a lot of redwoods there. And what we're trying to do is get point locations about where redwoods actually are. And this is going to be a hybrid of naturally occurring redwoods and redwoods that have been planted. So we understand that it isn't just looking at the natural range of redwoods, but if we can see where redwoods are surviving, even under some pretty extreme environmental conditions in urban environments, we're going to start to get better bounds on what the physiological thresholds are for redwoods as a species. And you can also take observations of other plants. So for me, I really love ferns. I go out and I take lots of observations of ferns when I'm outside. So to go back to my final question, how will redwood forests respond to climate change? There's so little that we know. I always feel like the wet blanket. I'm like, well, we don't know this, we don't know that. But we're starting to collect data, and we're set up a framework now to do the monitoring systematically throughout the redwood forest range and through time. And it needs a cohesive effort among scientists and also the public. Our scientists literally cannot go out and climb every tree and collect all the data. So we're constantly looking for new ways to engage the public and help us reach the areas of the forest that we can't be in every day ourselves. So we're really excited about what citizen science can do to contribute to our research projects and also provide an opportunity for the public to learn more about redwood forest ecology and climate change as they're participating. All of the research that I've been talking to you about has been done as a huge collaborative effort. We couldn't do this without the Semper Virens Fund, who's been providing a lot of support for us. Ken Fisher has been, he's a private philanthropist that has helped get our initiative going. And so many people in the fields and at the universities that have contributed to the research. The Moore Foundation also has been supporting this research. So I just want to acknowledge the fact that Save the Redwood League hopes to be pulling together and be creating a repository for information that can help land managers as they're trying to understand what do we do out in these forests to help steward them through the coming decades of climate change. We want to connect scientists and collaborations, and we're happy to be in the position to be supporting this research and this collaborative effort.